My husband brought his mistress to live with us and manipulated our son to call her mom. But when I discovered he stole $83K from my son's trust fund, I destroyed them both and they never saw what I did coming. I'm 32 years old. I'm a pediatric nurse, and what happened 6 months ago literally destroyed everything I thought was my life. I'm talking about my 8-year marriage, my family, my home, everything. And the truth is, I'm still processing how things got to this point. Because when you marry someone, when you have a child with that person, you never expect them to betray you in the most cruel way possible. You know what I mean? I guess I should start at the beginning. Or well, at the moment when everything exploded. Because what happened before that makes a lot more sense now looking back. It was a Sunday morning, like 9:30, and I was coming home after a weekend shift at the hospital. I work with children, mostly with chronic conditions or recovering from complicated surgeries, and that weekend had been particularly hard because we had 2 emergencies and I barely slept like 4 hours total. I remember I was driving my Honda Curvy thinking only about taking a hot shower and getting into bed, and maybe spending some time with Oliver, my 6-year-old son. David, my husband, was a corporate lawyer at a big firm downtown. You know, one of those places where they work like crazy and earn pretty good money. And supposedly that weekend he was going to stay with Oliver while I worked. That was normal. We had established that routine since Oliver was like 2 years old, and I went back to work full-time. I got to the house and from outside everything looked normal. We lived in a quiet neighborhood, like suburban, a 2-story house with a yard and all that. I parked in the driveway, grabbed my bag from the back seat, and when I walked in through the front door, the first thing I noticed was that there was music playing in the kitchen. That was already weird because David wasn't one of those people who put on music on Sunday mornings. He was more about absolute silence while he read the newspaper with his coffee. I left my things at the entrance and walked toward the kitchen, and what I saw made me feel like I'd been punched in the stomach. There was a woman standing in front of the stove, cooking something that smelled like pancakes, and she was wearing my apron, the one my mom had given me when Oliver was born, the one that had "World's Best Mom" embroidered on it. The woman had blonde hair, like 30-something years old, and she was moving around my kitchen like it was her house. I stood there, unable to say anything, literally couldn't process what I was seeing, and then I heard Oliver's voice from the living room. He was saying something like, "Can I help you set the table, Mommy?" And I thought he was talking to me. But when I looked toward the living room, I saw he was talking to her, to this strange woman in my kitchen. Oliver came running in with some plastic plates, and when he saw me, he froze for a second, and then smiled and said, "Oh, hi, Emma," and I felt the world falling apart around me because my son, my baby, had called me by my name, instead of calling me Mom. The woman turned around when Oliver spoke, and the expression on her face was pure panic, like she didn't expect to see me there, which obviously she didn't expect, because I wasn't supposed to arrive until the afternoon. David came down the stairs at that moment. He was wearing a t-shirt and pajama pants, and when he saw me standing at the kitchen entrance, his face turned completely white. "Emma," he said, "I thought you were arriving at 5, and I just looked at him and said, 'Clearly. But the question is, what the hell is going on here, and who is this woman in my kitchen wearing my apron?' The woman, who turned out to be named Jessica, started saying something about how she was staying with us because her apartment had plumbing problems or something like that. But I wasn't listening anymore because Oliver walked up to her and took her hand and said, 'Don't worry, Mommy, Emma's not angry,' and that's when something broke inside me. I asked Oliver, 'Honey, why are you calling her Mommy?' And he looked at me with those big eyes he has and said, 'Because Daddy says she's my real mommy, that you're always working and that she loves me more.' I don't know how I managed to keep my composure in that moment. The truth is, I felt like I was going to throw up or pass out, or both. I told Oliver to go play in his room for a moment, that the adults needed to talk, and he left, but before leaving, he gave Jessica a hug and told her he'd be back soon. When Oliver went upstairs, I turned to David and Jessica and basically exploded. I yelled at them, what the hell were they thinking? How dare they do this? How was it possible that David had brought his mistress into our house, into the house where our son lived, and on top of that had manipulated Oliver into calling her mom? David tried to explain himself, saying it wasn't what it seemed, that Jessica was just staying a few days and had nowhere to go. But I was already so furious I couldn't even think clearly. Jessica had the nerve to tell me that she hadn't done anything wrong, that David and she had fallen in love and that I should be more understanding because I worked too much and neglected my family. When she said that, I literally laughed. I mean, I laughed out of pure disbelief, because this woman was telling me, a pediatric nurse who worked to pay half the household expenses and to give my son a good life, that I was neglecting my family while she was getting into my bed and manipulating my son. I told her to get out of my house immediately, to take her things and never come back, and she looked at me with that victim expression and said she couldn't leave because she had nowhere to go. David defended her, said that Jessica could stay a few more days until she found another place, and I told him no, that either she left right then or I was leaving with Oliver. What David and Jessica didn't know was that I had already discovered things before that Sunday. Like 2 weeks before, I had found some documents in David's study while looking for some papers for Oliver's insurance. They were account statements from a trust fund that David had inherited from his father, a trust fund that was supposed to be for Oliver's college education and for family emergencies. The numbers didn't add up, like $80,000 were missing. And when I checked the transactions, I saw that David had been regularly transferring money to an account I didn't recognize. I also found purchase receipts for a property, a condominium downtown that was in David's name and someone else's. And when I searched that name on Google, Jessica appeared, a lawyer at the same firm where David worked. Besides that, I found printed emails in a folder hidden in his desk. They were exchanges between David and Jessica that went back like 2 years. I mean, this wasn't something new. This had been happening since Oliver was 4 years old. The emails were explicit, talking about meetings in hotels, about plans for the future together. And in one of them, David literally said that I was an obstacle, but that he would soon find a way to get me away from Oliver so that Jessica could be the mother our son deserved. When I read that, I felt like my heart was being ripped out. Because one thing is for your husband to cheat on you. That's horrible, but it happens. But something very different is for him to plan to take your child away and replace you with someone else. That Sunday, after the confrontation in the kitchen, I went up to my room, well, what had been our room, and started packing my things. David followed me and tried to stop me, saying we were exaggerating things, that we could fix this like civilized adults. But I was already beyond any civilized conversation. I told him I was taking Oliver and we were leaving. And he got aggressive. Not physically, but verbally, saying that I couldn't just take him like that, and that he had rights as a father and that if I tried to take Oliver away from him, he was going to sue me for parental kidnapping or something ridiculous like that. I told him I wasn't kidnapping anyone, that I was taking my son away from a toxic situation where his father had brought his mistress to live with us and had manipulated the child into calling her mom. I packed several suitcases with clothes for me and Oliver, grabbed his favorite toys and his school things. And when I came downstairs with everything, David was in the living room with Jessica, both sitting on the couch like they were the perfect couple. I told them I was leaving and that my lawyer would be in touch soon. And David laughed and said I didn't have the money to afford a good lawyer, that he knew the best ones in the city, and that none of them would take me as a client if he called first. That made me realize the level of manipulation and control that David had exercised for years, because he had always insisted that he handle all our finances, that he pay for everything, and I, like a fool, had accepted thinking it was because he earned more and because he was more organized with money. I went to Oliver's room and told him to pack his backpack with his favorite things because we were going to stay a few days with Grandma Margaret, David's mom. I know it sounds weird to go to my mother-in-law's house, but Margaret and I had always had a good relationship, and I knew she wouldn't approve of what David was doing. Plus, I needed a safe place for Oliver while I sorted everything else out. Oliver asked me if Jessica was coming with us, and when I said no, that it was just going to be him and me, he seemed confused but didn't protest. I think deep down he knew something wasn't right. Kids sense those things even when they can't express it in words. I drove straight to Margaret's house, which was like half an hour away in an older but very nice neighborhood. When we arrived, it was like 11 in the morning and Margaret was in her garden fixing some flowers. She was surprised to see us arrive with suitcases, and when I asked if we could stay a few days, she said, of course, that her house was always open to us. Oliver ran inside to greet his grandmother, and I took the opportunity to briefly tell her what had happened. Margaret got furious. And when I say furious, I mean I had never seen her like that. She told me that David had turned out like his father, that he had also been unfaithful and that had destroyed their marriage like 30 years ago, and that she had sworn not to allow her son to do the same thing to another woman. Margaret helped me set up our things in the guest room, and then we sat in the kitchen while Oliver watched cartoons in the living room. I told her about the documents I had found, about the missing money from the trust fund, and about the condominium in David and Jessica's names. Margaret went pale when I told her about the trust fund, because that money had been inherited from Oliver's grandfather, with very specific conditions. And one of those conditions was that it could only be used for the direct benefit of the family's descendants, meaning for Oliver in this case. Margaret told me she was one of the trust administrators, along with a family attorney, and that David had no authority to use that money for anything other than Oliver's education or welfare. That same day, Margaret called the trust administrator attorney and told him about the suspicious transactions. The attorney, an older man named Richard, who had been a friend of David's father, said that was a serious violation of the trust terms and that he was going to start an immediate investigation. By Monday morning, the trust was frozen, and David received notification that he was under investigation for misuse of funds. Also that Monday, I went to see a family lawyer that a coworker at the hospital had recommended to me, a woman who specialized in complicated custody cases and had a reputation for being very aggressive when it came to protecting children. I told my lawyer everything, showed her the documents I had found, told her about Jessica living in my house and about how they had manipulated Oliver into calling her mom. The lawyer, whose name was Patricia, told me that what David and Jessica had done was called parental alienation and that it was very serious, that judges took it very seriously, especially when it involved such young children. She told me we were going to ask for emergency custody and that we were going to present evidence that David had created an inappropriate environment for Oliver by bringing his mistress to live with them without considering a child's emotional well-being. The next few days were total chaos. Patricia filed the emergency custody petition on a Tuesday morning, and by Wednesday, David received the summons along with a temporary restraining order that prohibited him from approaching Oliver until there was a hearing. David called me like 20 times that day, leaving me furious messages saying that I had poisoned his mother against him, that I was a manipulator and that I was going to lose custody because I was an absent mother who prioritized her work over her son. I deleted all the messages after Patricia told me to save them as evidence of David's inappropriate behavior. What happened next was like a domino effect. Turns out that at the law firm where David and Jessica worked, there were very strict rules about relationships between colleagues, especially when one of them had a position of power over the other. David was a junior partner and Jessica was a senior associate, but David had been her mentor when she joined the firm like 3 years ago, so technically there had been a power relationship from the beginning. Margaret, who was still furious with her son, decided to call the firm's managing partner and tell him about the situation. The partner, a man named Thomas who had known David's family for years, got in touch with Human Resources and the firm's ethics committee. The firm started its own internal investigation into the relationship between David and Jessica, and what they discovered was worse than anyone expected. It turned out that David had been giving Jessica preferential assignments, high-profile cases that would normally go to more experienced associates, and had been pushing the other partners to promote her to junior partner ahead of time. They also found emails where David was sharing confidential information about other firm cases with her, information that Jessica wasn't authorized to see, and evidence that they had used client contacts from the firm for their own personal investments, specifically to buy that condominium I told you about. By the end of that first week, both David and Jessica were placed on administrative leave while the investigation continued. The emergency custody hearing took place that Friday, and I went with Patricia and all the documents I had compiled. David arrived with his own lawyer, an aggressive guy from his firm who tried to paint me as an absent and mentally unstable mother, but the judge didn't believe him at all when Patricia presented the evidence. There were photos of the apron Jessica was wearing that Sunday. There were text messages between David and Jessica, talking about their plans to alienate Oliver from me, and most importantly, there was a report from a child psychologist that Margaret had paid to evaluate Oliver after what happened. The psychologist confirmed that Oliver showed signs of confusion about his parental figures and that he had been a victim of parental alienation. He said that Oliver had developed separation anxiety and that in the sessions he had expressed fear that I would abandon him because his dad had told him I didn't love him as much as Jessica did. When the judge read that report, he got visibly upset and told David's lawyer that his client's conduct was unacceptable and potentially harmful to the minor's emotional development. The judge granted me temporary primary custody with supervised visitation for David and ordered that Oliver start therapy with a psychologist specializing in parental alienation cases. During the following weeks, the investigation at the law firm continued, and things got worse and worse for David and Jessica. They discovered that not only had they had an undisclosed relationship, but they had violated multiple firm policies related to conflicts of interest and misuse of confidential information. They found evidence that David had used information from an important corporate client to make personal investments, and that he had shared that information with Jessica, who also invested based on privileged data. That was illegal, not just a violation of internal policies, and the firm had no choice but to fire them both. The news that David and Jessica had been fired spread quickly in the city's legal world because the firm was very respected, and these kinds of scandals didn't happen often. David temporarily lost his license to practice, while the State Bar Association investigated allegations of unethical conduct, and Jessica also faced the same process. The trust fund investigation revealed that David had diverted exactly $83,000 over a 2-year period, money he had used to pay the down payment on the condominium, for trips with Jessica, and to give her expensive jewelry and clothes. The trust administrator permanently revoked David's access to those funds and sued him for full restitution. Margaret supported me in everything during this time, and the truth is, I don't know what I would have done without her. She helped me financially when I needed it, stayed with Oliver when I had long shifts at the hospital, and went to court with me at every hearing. She told me she had gone through something similar when David's father cheated on her with his secretary like 30 years ago, and that she had to raise David alone because her husband left with the other woman and basically abandoned them. She told me she wasn't going to allow her son to do the same thing to another woman and her grandson, and that although she loved David, she couldn't support his actions. Oliver started therapy with a psychologist who specialized in children who had experienced parental alienation. The first sessions were difficult because Oliver was confused and didn't understand why he couldn't see Jessica, and he kept asking about her. The psychologist explained to me that it was normal, that children form bonds quickly, and that Oliver had been manipulated to see Jessica as a positive maternal figure. She told me that with time and consistent work, Oliver could recover, but that it was important to be patient and not force anything. The supervised visits between David and Oliver took place at a special center where a monitor was present the whole time. David tried to use those visits to continue speaking badly of me to Oliver, telling him things like, "Mommy forced me to leave my job. Mommy is bad because she won't let me see you more." But the monitor reported everything to the court, and that only made David's legal situation worse. The judge warned him that if he continued trying to alienate Oliver from me, he was going to completely lose his visitation rights. The Bar Association investigation concluded like 3 months after everything started, and the result wasn't good for David or Jessica. Both were formally accused of multiple ethical violations, including conflict of interest, mishandling of confidential client information, and use of privileged information for personal benefit. The Ethics Committee recommended indefinite suspension of their licenses with possibility of permanent disbarment, which basically means they would probably never practice as lawyers in this state again. Jessica finally moved out of the condominium she had shared with David, and it turned out that whole story about water damage in her apartment had been a lie from the beginning. Her apartment was perfectly fine. She had simply decided to move in with David because they thought I was going to accept the situation or that I would leave without fighting. Margaret told me that David had told Jessica that I was submissive and that I wouldn't cause problems, that I would just leave quietly and let them have Oliver. It hurt to know that my husband saw me that way, as someone so weak that she wouldn't fight for her own son. Oliver gradually started to improve with therapy. He stopped asking about Jessica after like 6 weeks and started calling me Mom again instead of Emma. The first time he called me Mom after everything that happened, we were at Margaret's house making cookies and he asked me for help reaching something, and he just said, "Mom, can you help me?" And I started crying right there in the kitchen. Margaret hugged me and told me the worst was over, that Oliver was going to be okay, and that I had done the right thing by fighting. Of the divorce process moved faster than I expected. David didn't have much to fight with after losing his job and after everything about the misuse of the trust fund and the relationship with Jessica was revealed. My lawyer, Patricia, was relentless, asking for permanent primary custody with limited and supervised visits for David, equal division of assets including the sale of the family home, and child support for Oliver. David tried to negotiate but didn't have much bargaining power considering everything that had come to light. The house finally sold like 5 months after I left, and after paying the mortgage and dividing what was left, I received my half plus additional compensation for the misuse of the trust fund that had affected Oliver's future. It wasn't a huge amount, but it was enough for a down payment on a smaller house in a neighborhood with better schools, which was what I wanted. Margaret helped me with the purchase details and the move, and Oliver was excited to have his own a bedroom and a yard where he could play. Custody was officially established like 2 months ago. I have primary custody and David has the right to supervised visits every other weekend for now, with the possibility of them becoming unsupervised after he completes a co-parenting program and more individual therapy sessions. The judge made it clear that any future attempt at parental alienation would result in complete loss of visitation rights, and David seems to have finally understood, because his recent visits have been appropriate, according to the reports. 2 weeks ago, Oliver asked me if someday his dad was going to come back to live with us. I told him the truth in a way he could understand. I explained that Daddy and I weren't going to be together again because Daddy made decisions that hurt our family, but that didn't mean Daddy didn't love him. Oliver thought about it for a moment and then asked me if Jessica was going to come back, and when I told him no, that Jessica wasn't part of our family and never would be, he sighed with relief and hugged me. He told me, "It's okay, Mommy. I like being just with you and Grandma Margaret better." And that was enough for now, I guess. Margaret and I are planning a small party for Oliver's 7th birthday next month. Just close family and some friends from school. And, for the first time in a long time, I feel like we can start rebuilding something good from all this mess.